Hello and welcome to Fowl Plays, where we look at tales of tabletop tragedy that are sure to ruffle some feathers. I'm your host, Boss Goose, and in today's story, we have a player who tries to rules lawyer the DM before Session 0 even begins, who then decides they want to be the leader of the group, inserting themselves into every NPC interaction and attempting to dictate what the other players do on their turns, eventually irritating everyone until they decide to confront him, leading to a series of inappropriate excuses that result in their removal from the campaign. So take a seat and wet your beaks as we dive on into today's tale. I've read a lot of posts on this sub, and now that enough time has passed since the story, I think it's time I share my own horror story. Sorry for the length, I tried to cut the unimportant bits. I love D&D, especially being a DM. At the start of the pandemic, and during the time of lockdowns, I had the itch to want to run some D&D. I decided to try my hand at forming a group using r/LFG. I made my post there stating I was going to run Out of the Abyss and waited for the responses. Anyone who has posted there looking for players knows that responses come pretty fast. I was naive, however, and did not really do the vetting process and just let people join my game on a first come first serve basis. This is where the horror story begins. The first person to respond was a guy who I'll call Jeff for this story. Before I invited people to the Discord server where I would run the game, I did a quick little voice chat with them as a vibe check. By quick, I mean like 1 minute of talking and then sent them the link. Jeff was a little more than pushy on his voice call. He immediately started asking about other players, what they were playing, how much homebrew I did to the system, what the game was going to be like, etc. Not a major red flag, people can be pretty excitable when it comes to the game, so I paid it no mind and invited him to the server. I eventually found enough people to play and set the date and time for Session 0. Prior to Session 0, I encouraged everyone in chat to talk and be friendly and get to know everyone and maybe discuss characters. This is where the first red flag happened. Jeff would not only be in chat constantly, but dominated any conversation that occurred. He had a very specific character he wanted to play, a very edgy half-elf vengeance paladin, and would go on and on about it to everyone in chat, and kept asking other players to play characters to complement his character. I tried to keep the peace by saying that people can play whatever they want, and that we would be doing character creation during Session 0 as a group, so players can talk about shared backstories and stuff like that. Jeff would not let up though, and eventually the chat remained silent until Session 0 because they didn't want to be ranted at by Jeff. Second red flag, the arguing. Jeff loved to debate and argue everything, especially rules and limitations I had set. Even before Session 0, Jeff would constantly ask me very specific rulings and personal messages. It's been a while, so I do not remember a specific example, but it would normally go, if I do X and then do Y and then cast Z spell, I should be able to do this oddly specific thing to gain advantage or bonus damage or disable the enemy, right? I would tell him how I would rule, and then he would go on long rants about how physics and science works, and how the rules technically say this, and how he was right and how I should allow it. He also loved to bring up that a DM should never say no, and just allow crazy ideas that should always work. This will come up later. Session 0. The red flags continue. We finally make it to Session 0 and the players start creating their characters. Jeff, the entire time, tries to point out how the party does not have a rogue to check for traps and needs a dedicated healer, and that we need to start thinking about how to cover weaknesses right away. This, of course, irritated the other players. I reiterate that I balance things around the party so that they do not need to worry about optimal party dynamic. Jeff would continue to talk about how to plan for specific situations given the party's weaknesses, but the other players just ignored him. Also during this session, I went over the rules I would be using, and of course Jeff had a lot to say about it. I said that I'll be requiring variant encumbrance rules, with the added homebrew that armor weighs half when worn, and that the party will have to track food and water, as stated in the DMG. Jeff hated this. He claimed that variant encumbrance ruins his build, and that it's unfair. I told him that as a survival horror game, I will not remove the rule. Second, he claimed the food and water rules were unrealistic and should be less. For those of you who do not know, the DMG states that small and medium creatures need 1 pound of food and 1 gallon of water each day or they will suffer exhaustion effects. Jeff claimed that was unrealistic and it should be way less, and tried to use crappy science to justify this. Thankfully, one of the other players is a veteran who served in Iraq and claimed that based on his real-life experience that the rules in the DMG were actually way generous, and thankfully this shut Jeff up. I later learned Jeff was obsessed with the idea of the military. Lastly, he would not stop pushing for me to let the party use variant flanking rules so that he didn't have to rely on the other players for advantage. I denied him, and he argued, of course. Clearly not a team player, which the first two sessions showed. Sessions 1 and 2, the last straw. This is where everyone got sick of Jeff. During the first session, Jeff would not let anyone else talk and always had to be a part of whatever conversation the characters were having, even if his character was not present for the interaction. Jeff also had the need to be the quote leader of the group as well. Whenever they had to figure out a challenge, Jeff immediately had a crazy 100% foolproof plan that would work as long as everyone else did exactly what he said to do. He tried to constantly tell the other players what they should do because it was the most optimal. He basically would not let anyone else play the game. Not only did he do this, he would metagame everything. He would try to warn others about monster statistics like HP, AC, and weaknesses, and I had to constantly remind him to cut it out. During combat, he would try to ask to do crazy maneuvers to see what he could get away with. One example would be that he wanted his character to do a standing front flip to jump over the enemy to get behind them and grab their dropped weapon in the process. I said no. He of course argued that he should be able to roll for it. I read him the jumping rules in the player's handbook. He sulked but accepted it. And like I said, he would try to tell other players what to do on their turns. Thus was the first session. The second session he kept snapping at the players for speaking about what-ifs and their plans out loud because Jeff thought that doing so would make the DM change things to ruin their plans or throw out the worst case scenario onto the players. I'm not an adversarial DM and would never do that, and I had to constantly remind him too. In between the first and second sessions, I talked to him about stopping some of his behaviors and told the other players that they can call it out too if it happens again. This was Jeff's idea, mind you. Well, whenever Jeff was called out, he would overly apologize and say things like, "I'm sorry I'm being so autistic," or "Sorry I'm an R-word." Now, given that one of the other players in the group is actually autistic, this made everyone very angry. After the second session, I had a conversation with Jeff and I kicked him from the game. I never thought I'd have to kick someone from a game before, but he was ruining everything for everyone. The game is continuing till this day, thankfully, but I never thought I would ever have to deal with a that guy before. Let this be a lesson to us all. Vetting is important. There's an unfortunately large reserve of that guys out there, and a little vetting can go a long way to preventing one of them from ruining your game. Right from the get-go, Jeff seemed to be trying to rules lawyer his way into gaining some advantage with the DM, and it's never a good sign when the game hasn't even begun and you have a player complaining that your rules are going to break their character. Now, I don't blame the DM for not taking action before the sessions actually started, because like they said, people do tend to get excited when it comes to creating a character and starting a new campaign, so it is possible that things could have improved with time. Unfortunately, Jeff's reaction to being called out on his behavior was pretty bad. It's not cool to make derogatory remarks and make light of people's mental conditions, especially when someone sitting at the table happened to have autism. Between that and the other issues like the rules lawyering and the arguing, I'm not surprised the DM decided to cut Jeff loose, and hopefully he learned his lesson about vetting when recruiting people online. And fingers crossed, hopefully this experience taught Jeff to be a bit more considerate of others, and lean more into the collaborative nature of D&D rather than trying to dictate everything themselves. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video and sticking around till the end. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I upload new content every Thursday and Sunday, so make sure you check out my channel for more D&D stories. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave me a goosebump in the comments below. As always, the support is appreciated. But until next time, be good players.